like this, with the air just at freezing and a few clouds hanging over the Delaware River Valley. Delaware Township feels exactly like what it is. A quietly rural pocket of old New Jersey, more fields and farm lanes than strip malls. This township sits in the southwestern corner of Hunterdon County, its southwestern edge running right along the Delaware River, with small villages and hamlets: Sargentsville, Rosemont, Raven Rock, Locktown, Sandbrook, scattered among rolling farmland. It was carved out in 1838 from what was once Old Amwell Township, one of the earliest townships in the county, so the roots here go back to the early 1700s. The landscape tells that history. You still have working farms, old stone farmhouses, and traces of the 19th century mill economy. By 1840, the township supported multiple grist mills, sawmills, and even an oil mill powered by its creeks. Sargentsville, the main village, grew from an early 1700s settlement and today feels like a classic crossroads town, complete with civic buildings and historic homes clustered around rural roads. One of the township's claims to fame is wonderfully modest but beloved: the Green Sergeant's covered bridge over Wickicheakay Creek, the only remaining historic covered bridge in the entire state, just west of Sargentsville. Local residents fought hard to preserve it when replacement was once proposed, which tells you a lot about how attached people are to their landscape and history here. It's the kind of place where seasonal rhythms still matter: quiet, snowy lanes in winter like tonight, roadside farm stands and cornfields in summer, and Delaware River recreation: kayaking, fishing, cycling, never far away. Nearby spots such as Bull's Island and the riverfront hamlet of Raven Rock add dramatic cliffs and towpath walks to the mix, giving this small township an outsized share of scenic, lived-in history. Norristown sits along the Schuylkill River just outside Philadelphia, and it has the feel of a once industrial county seat that's quietly reinventing itself rather than starting from scratch. It was laid out in the early 18th century on land once called the Manor of Williamstadt, tied to William Penn's family, and later sold to merchant Isaac Norris, whose name the town carries. By the early 1800s, it had become the governmental hub of Montgomery County, and the Montgomery County Courthouse, dating from the 1850s, still dominates the skyline with its grand dome and stonework. What stands out nearby is the contrast between dense, historic streets and surprisingly large green spaces. Just north of town, Norristown Farm Park preserves old farmsteads, mill sites, and fields that trace back to 18th century plantations, some of whose stones were reused when Norristown State Hospital was built. It's one of those places where you can walk past old stone houses and imagine when this was all working countryside. The historic core still shows off row houses on a tight grid of streets, more urban than the later suburbs that ring it. Many older buildings have been repurposed. A former firehouse now houses Five Saints Distilling, a small sign of Main Street's slow comeback. A short hop away, Valley Forge National Historical Park anchors the region's Revolutionary War story and draws most of the out-of-towners. Climate-wise, you get classic mid-Atlantic seasons, humid farming village, part historic crossroads, and part garden gateway. On a crisp evening like this, with the air just below freezing and only a few clouds hanging over the upper Chesapeake, Cecil County feels very true to character. Quiet, a bit stoic, and deeply tied to its waterways and old roads. This corner of northeastern Maryland is where the Susquehanna River meets the top of the Chesapeake Bay, and where, historically, people passed through on their way somewhere else. By canoe, by tall ship, by canal boat, by railroad, and eventually by highways and Interstate 95. That crossroads feeling still defines it. Historically, it's an old place by American standards. John Smith explored these rivers in 1608, and by 1674 Cecil was carved out as its own county, thanks in part to a visionary mapmaker, Augustine Herman, who dreamed up both the county and the idea of a canal slicing between the Elk River and Delaware Bay. That canal, the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, finally opened in 1829, cutting nearly 300 sailing miles and turning Little Chesapeake City into a canal town where you can watch 900-foot ships slide under a soaring bridge. The county is dotted with 18th-century farms and Georgian manor houses, like Bohemia Farm in Earlville, famous for its elaborate Rococo plasterwork and Chinese Chippendale staircase, one of the finest Georgian houses on Maryland's eastern shore. There are more than 50 sites on the National Register here, old mills, churches, and modest farmsteads that tell a very working, lived-in story of the region. Economically and culturally, Cecil is a blend of horse country, river recreation, and logistics. Equestrian events at Fair Hill, boating and fishing on the bay and rivers, warehouses and truck stops lining the I-95 corridor. A fun, slightly haunting detail: when the Conowingo Dam went into full operation in 1928, the rising reservoir permanently submerged an entire village called Conowingo, 30 or 40 buildings, gone under what's now a 9,000-acre lake. People still fish and birdwatch there, knowing a town lies quietly below the water. Rosedale, just northeast of Baltimore, has a quiet, lived-in feel that tells a story of farms turning into neighborhoods. For a long time, this stretch of Baltimore County was mostly plantations and farmland, and the name itself is said to come from a young Englishman named Dale who grew so many roses on his farm that people started calling it Rosedale. It's the kind of origin story that sticks. 1800s, German and Polish immigrants were settling here, and the community slowly grew around schools and local industry. The first school was a small wooden building with just 2 rooms, at the corner of Hamilton Avenue and Philadelphia Road. Over the decades, especially in the 1950s, Rosedale transformed into a classic post-war suburb, with rows of brick and frame homes that still define much of the area today. It's a practical, working neighborhood with strong ties to nearby Dundalk and Baltimore's industrial history. The local library branch has a children's learning center called Storyville, full of little play zones that make early learning feel like play. If you're in the mood to explore, the Patapsco Valley and Gunpowder Falls are within easy reach, offering trails and green space that locals use year-round. Winters here are generally mild but can feel raw near the water, while summers bring humidity and the kind of heat that makes the local parks and pools popular. Rosedale doesn't put on much of a show, but it's the kind of place where people know their neighbors and where a simple name like Rosedale carries more history than you'd guess at first glance. Fort Meade is one of those places that looks like just another patch of Maryland suburbs, but it's actually one of the most strategically important bits of land in the country. It began in 1917 as Camp Meade, carved out as one of 16 big training posts for troops heading to fight in World War I. More than 400,000 soldiers cycled through here in that war alone, and the place buzzed with horse-drawn artillery, early tanks, and the famous "Hello Girls," the bilingual women switchboard operators who kept communications running for the Army Signal Corps. Over time, it shifted from a classic training camp into a brain center. Today, Fort George G. Meade hosts over 115 federal agencies, including the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command, making it the largest employer in Maryland and one of the biggest Army workforces in the country. Billions of dollars in economic activity radiate from this one installation into the surrounding county. During World War II, it doubled as both a massive training post and a prisoner of war camp, holding German and Italian POWs and some civilian detainees. A number of them are still buried in a quiet cemetery on post. That gives the base an odd mix of high-tech present and very tangible, somber history. The feel on the ground is a blend of Beltway commuter town and security campus. Civilian neighborhoods, shopping centers, and schools ring an installation full of satellites, secure buildings, and the Defense Information School and U.S. Army Field Band rehearsing for ceremonies and tours. Climate-wise, it's classic mid-Atlantic, humid summers, mild but sometimes snowy winters, and leafy, colorful autumns that make the old parade grounds and training fields look surprisingly picturesque for a place so wrapped up in signals, secrets, and cyber. North Bethesda is one of those places that doesn't really brag, but it has a quietly interesting story once you start peeling back the layers. Historically, this stretch along Rockville Pike grew up on an old Native American route that became a colonial road between Georgetown and Fredericksburg. Washington here is a funny mix. Part working government campus, part open-air history book, and part surprisingly livable river city. The heart of it is that long greensward, the National Mall, with the Washington Monument spearing the skyline and the Lincoln Memorial brooding over the reflecting pool. Around it cluster memorials to wars and leaders, the World War II Memorial's ring of pillars, the quiet power of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and the more recent Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial by the tidal basin, which turns into a cloud of cherry blossoms each spring. Just to the east, the U.S. Capitol and the Library of Congress sit on their hill like an architectural lesson in neoclassicism. Between the Capitol and the Potomac you get that dense strip of Smithsonian museums, air and space with its moon capsule, natural history with dinosaur skeletons and the famous Blue Diamond, American history with the original Star-Spangled Banner. Day to day, the local economy runs on government, law, think tanks, and embassies, which gives neighborhoods like DuPont Circle and Embassy Row an unusually international feel. Yet 10 minutes away, Georgetown's cobblestone streets and the C&O Canal look more like an old port town than a capital. The climate is classic mid-Atlantic. Muggy summers, crisp falls with blazing foliage, cherry blossom springs, and winters that can't decide between rain and snow. That indecision is a local tradition. Food-wise, you get excellent global kitchens plus a few local obsessions. Half-smokes from street grills near the ballpark, Chesapeake crab on menus everywhere, and a thriving farmers market scene. One nice quirk. By law, building heights are tightly limited, so instead of a forest of skyscrapers you get a low, orderly skyline that keeps those domes, spires, and monuments always in view. Arlington is one of those places where everyday life and big chapters of American history share the same few square miles. It sits just across the Potomac from Washington, and for a lot of people the name is practically synonymous with Arlington National Cemetery. Those long, rolling hills of white headstones where presidents, astronauts, and hundreds of thousands of service members are buried. The eternal flame at John F. Kennedy's grave and the changing of the guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier are the most iconic moments there. But the county's story started long before that. You've got colonial-era farm life preserved at the tiny Ballsellers House, one of the oldest structures in the area, showing what a middling 18th-century farmer's world looked like. Scattered through the neighborhoods are earthwork remnants of Civil War forts like Fort C.F. Smith and Fort Ethan Allen, part of the ring that once defended the capital. Modern Arlington is dense, urban, and surprisingly vertical for a former suburb. Rosslyn and Crystal City are packed with offices, apartments, and hotel towers. The Pentagon anchors one end of the county and still shapes a lot of the local economy. Yet within a few minutes' walk you can slip onto wooded trails or over to Theodore Roosevelt Island, a forested memorial in the middle of the river with boardwalks through marshland and a big, open-air plaza dedicated to his conservation work. Culturally, it's a very museum-rich strip of land. The Arlington Historical Museum in the Old Hume School, the Black Heritage Museum of Arlington, and exhibits about places like Freedman's Village, a Civil War community for formerly enslaved people built on what is now cemetery land. If you ever notice how quickly the weather swings around here, sticky summers, crisp bright autumns, and the occasional moody snow, that's part of the character too. A busy, compact county where seasons and history both turn over fast.